Welcome on behalf of the Robert H. and Ho Family Foundation, Center for Buddhist Studies at Stanford, and on behalf of the Department of Religious Studies. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome you and to introduce our guest speaker, Michael Komo, who is the Toshu Fukami Associate Professor of Shinto Studies at Columbia University, where he holds a joint appointment in the Departments of Religion and East Asian Languages and Cultures. Professor Komo did his bachelor's degree at Harvard and then, like many Americans, dreamt of a better life in California. Made the long and arduous journey by wagon train across the continent and arrived here to complete his PhD at Stanford in the year 2000 in this very department, where he studied under Bernard Faure and Karl Bielefeld, who is here tonight with us.
And very important, too.
He has come along tonight to do what might be one of the most satisfying things an elderly professor can do, which is to bask in the reflected glory of his own student. No pressure, Michael. After graduating from Stanford, Professor Komo first taught at the College of William and Mary before moving to Columbia in 2005 as part of this department's grand strategy to colonize Columbia completely with its own graduates and professors, at least in the field of Asian religions, so that we can say that Columbia is the Stanford of the East. Professor Komo's research deals with the early religious history of Japan, from the Asuka period through the Nara and Heian periods to the early Kamakura, and pays special attention to imported deities, cults and traditions like Taoism and Buddhism, and their weaving into the complex fabric of Japanese religion during these formative early periods. Apart from various papers on these topics, Professor Komo is the author of two monographs. The first in 2008, Shotoku, Ethnicity, Ritual and Violence in the Japanese Buddhist Tradition, and then in the following year, Weaving and Binding, Immigrant Gods and Female Immortals in Ancient Japan. And he was also responsible with Bernard Faure and Ianaga Nobumi for an edited volume in the series Cahiers d'Extrême-Asie on rethinking medieval Shinto. We can now look forward to the third monograph, which will come out of his current research project, which addresses urbanization and social change in early Japan in the 8th and 9th centuries and their multiple effects on the religious life of that country. And so tonight's talk is drawn from this project, entitled Roadways, Shrines and Spirits in Ancient Japan. So welcome back to Stanford, Michael, and welcome everybody.
I think we should just stop here. That was really nice. Well, first of all, thank you, Irene. Thank you to the Ho Center. Thank you, everyone, for giving me this chance to come back. It's been almost 20 years for me, and so today I walked around campus a little bit and I really felt like a first-year graduate student again. And now I'm in the seminar where I did first-year theory and method for a year, so it really, really feels like I'm a grad student again in front of all these big people. So I hope it's okay. Today's talk, I hope, does not sound too much like inside baseball. I'm told 3 or 4 of you are not specialists in ancient Japanese religion, but we shall see. I at least, why am I not, oh dear. There we are. I at least have one cool slide for you, so if nothing else, you can look at, this is an insect that likes to eat demons, and this is the sort of thing I will be talking about today. So I guess I will just jump in. This paper is, as we just heard, part of a larger project that I've begun on questions of how widespread transformations in the material culture of 8th century Japan led to new and far-reaching changes in the ways that the people of the Japanese islands conceived of and then engaged superhuman spirits. And in contrast to the widespread tendency among scholars of Japanese religions to view these phenomena through the lens of imperial ideology, my concern will be to understand how changes in the material contexts in which ritual behavior was undertaken transformed the means by which the ancient Japanese engaged spirits, even as they also dramatically altered the caste of spirits that were engaged. So I take as my focus the 8th and early 9th centuries, when the advent of urbanization in the Japanese islands helped spur 3 shifts of momentous importance for the material contexts in which the gods, or the kami, of the land were worshipped. The first of these was constituted by a transformation in the material character of shrines that served as centers for the worship of kami. Whereas in the 7th century, shrines for kami worship were envisioned in terms of consecrated areas in natural environments, a large tree or a boulder in a forest that's marked off by a rope. From the 8th century, shrines for kami worship increasingly took the form of built structures in which the kami could dwell. A second, equally profound shift was engendered by the construction of road networks that at one and the same time served to A, facilitate the movement of people, goods, and spirits across the Japanese islands, B, create physical boundaries and borders that could be used in the defense of territory and against the incursion of malevolent spirits, and C, produce social crises related to the rapid movement of pathogenic microbes that could devastate local populations with little biological resistance. And finally, archaeological evidence from the 8th century has also established that this period witnessed the development of a widespread use of new ritual media, such as small human effigies or scapegoat dolls, which we see right here. Wooden tablets, which we see right here. Several of these wooden tablets inscribed with spells and prayers, pottery, and animal figurines. And these new ritual implements in turn appear to have been used to engage a broad range of hitherto unknown spirits, such as demons, disease deities, or ekijin, foreign gods, karakami, as well as a host of dragons, stove gods, well gods, jade women, and astral deities with clear roots in the ancient Chinese pantheon. So in what follows, my discussion of the above phenomena will have 3 interlocking goals. First, I hope to show that the above phenomena are best understood as responses to or developments stemming from the material and social disruptions that were created by the urbanization of the 8th century. Second, I hope to highlight the importance of the roadways of Japan as ritual sites that helped produce new forms of cultic activity involving new deities associated with movement, continental culture, and danger. In other words, I want to claim that the roadways of ancient Japan did not merely serve as alternate sites of pre-existing ritual forms. Rather, I'm going to argue that the roadways of ancient Japan helped call into being new modes of ritual engagement with a host of hitherto unknown spirits. Urbanization changed in some profound ways not only where spirits were engaged, how they were engaged, it also changed which spirits were engaged and how they were conceived. And finally, I want to call into question a great deal of received wisdom concerning the deities of the Imperial pantheon and this problematic thing we call Shinto. What I'd like to suggest is that the deities of the Imperial pantheon, which are accorded such a major role in most histories of Japanese religion, may have literally been marginal figures in the cultic life of the urban elite in the nation's capitals. All right, so the material environment of the Japanese islands changed dramatically during the late 6th and 7th centuries as Japanese rulers started to order the construction, or they ordered the construction of no fewer than 6 capitals within 100 years. As I just noted, this transformation was inseparable from a similar transformation in modes of understanding and engaging spirits that occurred at just this time. This is the very same period that saw the establishment of the ritual institutions and myths of the early Japanese state, the diffusion of Buddhist ritual practices and concepts across all sectors of society in central Japan, as well as the emergence of a host of popular religious practices that were not the focus of religious professionals. The reason for these temporal linkages between these phenomena, I think, is not hard to understand. Urbanization, as I just mentioned, produced profound changes in the world that the ancient Japanese were seeking to transform. Urbanization also produced radical changes in the sites in which performance could take place, and it produced a transformation in the material basis for religious practice. And finally, the very same networks that allowed for the diffusion of the materials and institution necessary for constructing and maintaining the urban centers were the conduits for the transformation of cults and deities. So it shouldn't be surprising that these two are linked. So let me talk a little bit about urbanization, what I mean by that. And I'm not going to try and define the term, I'm just going to give some attributes that are particularly important for my project. First of all, cities involve consumption of extraordinary amounts of resources, not only at the time of their construction, but throughout their existence, as large numbers of people living in a densely packed environment require the continuous importation of food, wood, and other basic materials of existence. 2, cities involve movement. This means most basically the movement of large numbers of people. The Nara, or Heijo capital, is thought to have housed somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 people at its peak, and the Heian capital is thought to have had as many, if not more. It also meant, of course, the continuous movement of goods and objects needed to feed, clothe, and house these new urban residents. Urbanization thus required the development of extended transportation networks that manifest physically in the form of roadways, canals, and bridges, and rest houses for travelers. The roadways that constituted the heart of this network will be the principal or a principal focus of this paper. 3, cities also involve disruption. This disruption is not limited to what happens within the city limits, but extends to the surrounding regions that take on the new role of supplying urban residents with their material needs. Old relationships to the land, natural resources, and the structure of social institutions such as ancestor worship, predicated upon the close proximity of participants, were all either replaced or modified. Managing this disruption was a primary spur for the development of the institutional and bureaucratic structures of the Japanese state. 4, cities produce what I call aftershocks. By this I mean secondary consequences that result from the movements and disruptions that urbanization entailed in human society. These effects necessarily extended well beyond the human realm. On the macro level, this involved the disruption of the natural environmental conditions related to forests that were clear-cut for timber, and they clear-cut most of central Japan in this period. Mountains that were mined for minerals, waterways that were dammed to control flooding, etc., etc. On the micro level, this can be seen in the creation of new hosts and modes of transport for microbes that could then spread into new areas, often with lethal effect. As we shall see shortly, such aftershocks also extended to the superhuman world as the material context in which humans and spirits interacted was transformed. Finally, cities also produce dislocation and relocation. Although this can be seen most obviously at the site of the capital, where one physical or cultic environment is essentially erased and a new one is imploded over it, it's crucial to understand that such dislocation extended to a far greater geographic sphere, reaching again into the superhuman world. In ancient Japan, the movement of large numbers of people into small, densely populated urban centers helped spur the movement of their related kami and ancestors. And in particular, the destruction of the forest habitats where the kami were believed to descend to earth to receive offerings, and the relocation of people far from their traditional sites of worship of their ancestors meant that residents of the capitals during the 7th and 8th centuries faced unprecedented questions concerning where and how to engage the superhuman world. For some similar reasons, new issues of where and how to bury the dead also came to the fore for urban dwellers. So I want to go on a little bit of a rant here before we move on and talk about the traditional approach to studying ancient Japanese religion and, by extension, Shinto, and why I'm taking this approach to looking at the worship of the kami. To a substantial degree, the categories of analysis for the study of Japanese religion were constructed and codified during the Meiji period, at a time when Shinto was refashioned into a political ideology identified with the essential spirit of the Japanese people and the emperor and the ruler. Because the Meiji period was also the period when the Japanese university system was created, though, categories such as native and foreign religion, the political and religious centrality of the imperial house, and the essentially Japanese nature of Shinto became essential elements in the construction of Japanese religion as an object of study. As a result, although very few, if any, Western scholars would write about Japanese religion in the triumphalist vein propagated by the pre-war Japanese government, the influence of these premises continues in an only slightly less obvious ways down to today. Among the most important of these influences has been an almost relentless privileging of the imperial house as both a source and center of Shinto or kami worship in Japan. Thus, in pre-war imperial ideology, the emperor was considered as the apex of Japanese spiritual identity, and other religions such as Buddhism, as well as the divinatory practices rooted in conceptions of yin-yang or five phases thought, or what we call onmyodo today, were constructed as foreign others that by definition could not have played a major role in the formation of Japan's national spirit, or kokutai. This tendency has been powerfully reinforced by the nature of our textual sources, which for the ancient period are almost exclusively made up of texts such as the Nihon Shoki, the Kojiki, and the Fudoki, all of which were composed by and for the court. Almost inevitably, the major concerns of these texts, such as the constitution of the imperial lineage, the relationship between rulers and the kami of Japan, as well as court ritual procedure, have become the primary focus of scholarship on the religion of the period. From here, it's but a short step to consider such concerns normative. And this step is taken, I might add, with depressing regularity by just about everybody. Because the court chronicles present the imperial line as well as its relationship with the kami in terms of a narrative of continuity, stretching back to the origins of Japan, the nature of political power as it relates to powers attributed to spirits and the very existence of the kami, etc., tends to be taken for granted as fixed objects suitable for study. As a result, histories of Shinto tend to rely on static, essentialized conceptions of both the court and ritual behavior in ancient Japan. These assumptions, to a surprising degree, can tend to inform contemporary accounts of the religion of the period, as scholars who are skeptical of the veracity of specific claims made by the court chronicles nonetheless continue to operate under the assumption that myths and rites are simply the enactment of ideological claims of the court. As an aside, I'm sorry to report that this is actually now probably more true in English language scholarship than it is in Japanese language scholarship. But this near exclusive focus on political and ideological lenses in turn promotes a set of further, subtler methodological prejudices that have only slowly begun to change in recent years. And among the most important of these are a focus upon text and intellectual or ideological projects of the court with little to no regard for the material context in which rituals were engaged. There's also a tendency to read rites and myths as alternate means of propagating claims of imperial hegemony or legitimacy. And we also find a heavy bias in favor of examining the ritual activities of professionals, especially those staffed by the Ministry of Deities or the Jingi-kan, or members of or officials at the shrines and temples of the land. And again, there's a pervasive, if not always explicitly stated assumption that somehow the court chronicles and the court's ritual agenda was representative, if not downright normative, for cultic life in the Japanese islands. So in light of these orientations, it's hardly surprising that the material disruptions inherent with the advent of urbanization, the rapid proliferation of new types of spirit, and major shifts in the material context of ritual practice in the 8th century have gone virtually unremarked, even in the most recent scholarship of the period. So how do we break from the cumulative weight of 100+ years of Meiji-influenced scholarship? Well, as I just said, one major stumbling block for thinking outside of the box has been that virtually all research on ancient Japanese religion takes as its starting point the court chronicles, or ritual documents that present the court as the dominant force in ancient Japanese cultic life. So today I'm going to try something new. Rather than beginning with the Nihon Shoki or Kojiki, I will take as my point of departure a seldom discussed text known as Kuchizusami. This work is a small educational primer for a 7-year-old Fujiwara boy that was composed by Minamoto no Tamenori, one of the most prominent intellectuals of his day. And although this text is from an admittedly later period, it was composed in 970, in many ways, Kuchizusami is an ideal text for our purposes because Tamenori states in his preface that his goal is to teach his 7-year-old pupil all the quotidian information that he will need in order to be a successful courtier. Information spanning the breadth of daily life in the capital is organized across some 30 topics, ranging from seasonal phenomena to architecture to the palace. Entries are presented in the form of terse, easy-to-memorize songs, a format that Tamenori tells us he composed in the belief that this was the easiest way to inculcate information without his young charge losing interest. I recommend this for undergrads as well. Because the text explicitly states that its goal is to set out basic knowledge and common sense for the child, it provides us with an invaluable opportunity to gain insight into how religious conceptions and rituals functioned in the daily life of people who were not religious professionals. Thus, the text is invaluable precisely for the reason that I believe it has been neglected, namely that it contains within it nothing that's cutting edge or new. It just contains common sense. And what we find is that a significant amount of this common sense is concerned in one way or another with ritual praxis. The largest section of the text, for instance, is the section on Buddhism. This section contains an eclectic mix of information regarding various temples, Buddhist festival days, and elements of doctrine or catechism. The second largest section, in turn, is dedicated to Onmyodo, or the way of yin and yang. This section highlights the importance of a number of spirits that I refer to as stowaway deities, that is to say, continental deities, whose cults were transmitted to the Japanese island, together with the transmission of the various technologies that made possible the construction of urban Japan. Most revealing, however, is the fact that references to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, as well as a large number of references to continental deities, such as the stove god, the jade women, astral deities, etc., are not confined to the explicitly religiously themed sections of the text, but rather they appear throughout the work. Buddhist and Chinese deities appear not only in sections devoted to Buddhism or Onmyodo, but rather in sections related to medicine, architecture, feng shui, and Michaela, music. In a similar vein, throughout the text, we find repeated stipulations concerning the proper times for performing such various daily activities based upon Onmyodo numerology and conceptions of the vicissitudes of yin and yang. Such considerations, we are told, are essential for deciding when one may take medicine, dig into the earth, put up a roof pole in a building, or travel. Spells are provided for use in such varied situations as when one is walking home in the dark, or when one hears a bell ring while taking a bath. I love that. In short, Kuchi Zasami introduces us to gods that people literally lived with and ritually engaged daily. And the overall impression generated by the text is a pervasive reliance upon ritual to engage superhuman spirits in order to transform both one's physical environment and one's body. Parenthetically, although Onmyodo and these stowaway gods are not the main focus of my paper today, I would like to point out that their presence too was almost certainly connected with urbanization. You simply cannot build a Chinese-style capital without first performing mantic rites or using feng shui. You cannot build a building without knowing the auspicious dates for erecting the central pillar. You cannot do weaving and sericulture without knowing about the Weaver Maiden cult and astrology. And you cannot live in a Chinese-style home without regularly propitiating the gods of the hearth, the well, the lavatory, etc. So the reason I term these deities stowaways is that they almost certainly came together with the importation of continental technologies that were essential for the urbanization process. They are hugely important, I would argue, because once they arrived, they almost by definition took up residence within people's homes and formed an important part of their daily lives. All right, back to Kuchi Zasami. In contrast to the wide variety of new continental deities and Buddhas that are discussed in the text, somewhat astonishingly, a close reading reveals that no gods from the imperial mythologies of the Kojiki or Nihon Shoki are mentioned in any cultic context whatsoever. I cannot think of any strong ideological or political reason for this neglect. The imperial deities are neither denounced nor are they even questioned. They're simply ignored. So at least as far as Kuchi Zasami is concerned, these gods, far from being at the center of ritual life for urban residents, were both literally and metaphorically of peripheral interest. In ancient Japan, it would appear that urban residents gave little thought to the kami of imperial mythology, even as they focused almost incessantly on the daily rituals of life in a capital teeming with immigrant deities residing in the kitchens, gates, weaving halls, temples, and roadways. We're thus left with a puzzle. Daily life in the capital is depicted as full of ritual engagement with a broad array of spirits, while at the same time devoid of deities from the imperial pantheon. Why is this, and what can it tell us about the role, or lack thereof, of the imperial deities that have been the almost exclusive concern of scholars of ancient Japanese religion for the past 100 years or so? For the remainder of this paper, I will suggest that both the sources and solutions for this puzzle can be found in the material contexts in which the ancient Japanese lived and engaged their superhuman world. So from now on, I'm going to proceed in two stages. First, I'd like to examine some fundamental shifts in the material nature of shrines dedicated to the worship of the kami. And then I'm going to discuss the system of avenues and highways that accompanied the constructions of the capitals. Spoiler alert, about to argue that these roadways constituted an alternate and no less important site for interactions between the human and superhuman worlds, and that they fell outside of the purview of the court chronicles. So let's talk about shrines. What happens if we start to look at this period in terms of the material situation in which events unfolded? As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, although the topic of urbanization has figured little, if at all, in even the most recent accounts of ancient Japanese cultic life, there's little doubt that at roughly the same time as the construction of the first capitals around the start of the 8th century, there was a decisive shift in the material nature of the shrines of Japan. As I said, prior to the 7th century, shrines in ancient Japan were almost invariably natural sites in such habitats as forests and mountains that were consecrated to particular deities. The kami of Japan were thought to descend to earth in primarily natural objects, such as trees or boulders, in order to receive offerings, after which they would return. There is little to no evidence indicating that the kami were believed to be very interested in human affairs. They appear to have been seen as particularly concerned, however, to protect their land from incursions by potentially impure human beings seeking to appropriate resources that had been consecrated to the kami. With the advent of urbanization, however, this mode of kami worship came under extreme pressure as the forests of central Japan were clear-cut for the construction and maintenance of the capitals and large monastic complexes. Aggressive policies encouraging the opening of new lands for agricultural development similarly involved the frequent disruption and appropriation of habitats that had formerly been consecrated to the kami. Cultically speaking, temple building, agricultural expansion, and urbanization were inherently violent acts that could disrupt or even eradicate the means by which the kami could descend to earth to receive offerings. Perhaps because of an implicit bias towards viewing shrines as sites for the performance of elaboration of imperial ideologies of hegemony and nation building, the significance of this shift has been remarkably under-theorized. As a result, in spite of the fact that the constructions of shrines as built structures has been commonly acknowledged by historians for decades, the degree to which the exigencies associated with the construction of material structures in physical time and space only rarely factor into scholarly accounts of new developments in the worship of kami that emerge at just this time. Once we look for the issue, however, we find it everywhere, even in the court chronicles and gazetteers. Specifically, we find numerous accounts of kami suddenly invoking tatari, or vengeance, zapping people basically, demanding that the court provide them with built structures and dedicated lineages committed to their regular worship. During this period, in fact, the construction and maintenance of built structures became a far-reaching concern that permeated relations with the kami in any number of profound ways. Fundamentally, however, from this time on in Japan, the kami of Japan demand not only food, but housing. As this shift occurred from natural habitat to built structures, new boundaries separating consecrated shrine territories from newly opened areas for taxation and cultivation had to be established. Shrine structures, in turn, required fixed rules for concerning physical upkeep, as well as, suddenly, a new concern for the maintenance of purity. New modes of material offerings to the kami and their shrines were also called into being as their new houses for the kami had to be furnished. So now we get new modes of ritual engagement, new types of offering. Now we're offering them clothing, we're offering them tables, we're offering them combs. And as a result, we get an anthropomorphized view of the kami for the first time in ancient Japan. On top of all of this, I would like to add two further observations concerning this process. The first of this is that for our purposes, one of the most important is that at this point in the 8th century, the kami of Japan literally came to be put in their place. In other words, we now have kami who are seen not dwelling in the heavens and occasionally coming down, but they are put in fixed locations, and the court and the people of Japan have to decide where to put every shrine and every god. Observation number 2. As consequential as the dynamic of furnishing built structures at shrines were for contemporaries of understandings of where, how, and by whom the kamis of Japan were to be engaged, a second equally important issue is where were the shrines and kami of Japan not allowed? And remarkably, and in direct contrast to the assertions of a great deal of recent scholarship that's come out even in English, I won't name any names, it is a simple geographic and, I would argue, institutional fact that beginning in the 8th century, Japanese rulers sought to put as much geographic and social distance as possible between themselves and the volatile, often vengeful kami of Japan. I mean that quite literally. Beginning in the 8th century, oh dear. Beginning in the 8th century, the court explicitly forbade the construction of shrines for kami worship within the capital. Here is a not particularly elegant map of the Heijo capital. You see all sorts of temples within the capital. You only see one shrine, Kasuga, right here, and it is outside. Why? 2 reasons. There are not so many shrines in the capital because they hadn't built many yet, and 2, the court wouldn't let them put them inside. Here we see the same thing with the Nagaoka capital and Heian. Anything with a circle is a shrine. You will notice that with only one exception, there are no shrines within either of these capitals. Dozens of Buddhist temples, however. So let that sink in for a minute. With the advent of urbanization, for the first time ever, the kami of Japan were forbidden from approaching a given area of the Japanese islands. And because of that, hundreds of thousands of urban residents were living in spaces with no shrines. And the reason for this was because the emperor and the court would not let them be there. I'll return to this in my conclusion, but first, to understand the significance of this and why it may have happened, I would like to talk more now about the cultic significance of roadways in Japan. So sadly, in spite of the by now substantial body of scholarship generated by archaeologists concerning the types and sizes of ritual implements that have been found on the roadways of ancient Japan, there has to date been almost no inquiry into the question of how the roadways themselves may have changed the character of rites for the engagement of spirits in Japan. What I'm suggesting today, though, is that this question is of the utmost importance for understanding the transformations and disruption of the material environment of Japan and how it was related to similarly dramatic changes in the ritual praxis of the period. More specifically, I'd like to suggest that because the roadways at one and the same time served as conduits for the material support of urban centers and as sites for the ritual engagement of spirits, they highlight the degree to which material realities of life in ancient Japan were both shaped and shaped by ritual goals and praxis. So before going any further, let me make a few comments about the material and social developments of roadways in ancient Japan and their importance for Japanese religion. First, in terms of their social function, roads everywhere served to connect people and places. What was distant and difficult to access now becomes convenient and close at hand. Roads in ancient Japan therefore served as borders and boundary markers, defining political jurisdictions and serving as barriers. This was true not only for the different regions of Japan, but also within the capital cities themselves, where social status and cultural topography was firmly delineated by the avenues and intersections that both subdivided the urban geography and gave it definition. In other words, the roadways of ancient Japan served as a crucial means of mapping and or remapping the cultural, political, and ritual life of the Japanese islands. Beyond these static considerations, however, the roadways of Japan served a more dynamic function as well. Roads, after all, mean motion. The explosion of road construction that accompanied the construction of capitals, of course, was required by the material needs of urban dwellers. Unable to feed themselves, rulers and urban residents of the capital required the means for the movement of food, raw materials, and provincial taxes into the capital. Even more fundamentally, roads were necessary for the movement of tens of thousands of new residents of the urban centers, as well as the many thousand more corvée laborers that were required for the construction of urban centers and their extraordinarily large temple complexes. Further, roads also meant speed. This was of major importance in at least two ways. First, cultural, ritual, and technological innovations could now go viral, as corvée laborers going into the capital brought these back with them to their homes in distant provinces when their corvée work was done. And as a result, cultic innovation associated with new technologies and improvisations in the urban populace that was forced to engage spirits in new ways diffused rapidly. Second, and most spectacularly, the back and forth movement of people, goods, and microbes between the capital and the coastal provinces also produced successive waves of epidemics that could kill, in the space of just a few months, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of residents in central Japan that lacked resistance to lethal microbes. The epidemic of 736 to 738 is thought to have perhaps killed up to 1/3 of the residents of Japan. And those microbes were all traveling on these roads. For this reason, finally and crucially, roadways thus also came to be seen as sites of danger. Imperial edicts from the latter decades of the 8th century make frequent reference to sites of propitiation for a new type of deity, the ekijin, or disease god, that have no ritual or textual precedent prior to that time, but which were believed to be the source of the recurring epidemics that were wreaking havoc across the land. Just to hammer this point home, by the end of the 8th century, we find within texts such as the Shokunihongi repeated edicts by the court concerning the proper worship or expulsion of disease deities known as ekijin, while in the Nihon Shoki and Kojiki, which is to say within classical imperial theology, these spirits are never mentioned. Within the court chronicles, we also find frequent references to the chronic problem of indigent corvée laborers dying on the roadways as they attempted to return to their native provinces. Such references, when read together with popular as well as official accounts of travelers encountering horse-riding spirits, corpses, and demons on the roadways, strongly suggests that from a very early date, the roadways of Japan had come to be seen as magnets for a host of dangerous spirits that were on the move across the land. In light of all of this, I would like to suggest that once we begin to conceive of the roadways of Japan as sites for engaging a variety of new and dangerous spirits on the move, it becomes possible to understand the emergence of the new forms of ritual activity that were intimately connected with the material dynamics of urbanization during the period. So I'm going to just, I don't have much time left. Just very briefly, I will just sum up. I'm going to talk very quickly about what the court did and then what we see in the popular context. Within the imperial ritual calendar, from this point on, we see new rites being developed, such as the Michiai Matsuri, the rite of roadside offerings, the Shogai Matsuri, the rite of blockage, and the Kyojo Shigu Matsuri, the rite of the four corners of the capital. And these rites, as you can see here, tend to be performed around a perimeter of defending the capital. And they involve new ritual media. Specifically here we see hitogata, these scapegoat dolls. So a brief summary of the salient points of these rites that I'd like to just go through is, one, these rites are designed to either send away impurities that may have accumulated from improper behavior in the capital, or expel or send off malevolent spirits that have entered the capital, or bar malevolent spirits from entering the capital. These rites are inherently defensive in nature. They are about defending borders. The rite of roadside offerings, for instance, is performed twice annually at the four major roadways leading into the capital in order to prevent malevolent spirits from coming in. Further, in 8th century Japan, roadsides we see are never simply bulwarks or barriers. They become contact zones in which people can engage spirits. And the media used for these rites, such as these scapegoat dolls, so here's what they look like close up, differ markedly from rites performed within the palace or anything that was done in the early 8th century. Similarly, the deities that they're propitiating are not mentioned in any of the imperial chronicles. In fact, none of these rites makes any mention whatsoever of any of the major deities from the imperial pantheon that we find in the Nihon Shoki or Kojiki. So to sum up, what we see in court-sponsored rites, roadway rites, are that they are designed to defend the capital from new types of disease-causing spirits without any basis in imperial mythology, using newly created ritual technologies and new types of ritual implements. Well, let's push this beyond the court. What can we see concerning what the populace is doing at this time? As Kaneko Hiroyuki has noted, the archaeological record indicates that sites of these types of ritual performances expanded over the 8th and early 9th centuries to include residential areas for non-elite segments of the society. Basically, everyone gets into the act. This, together with an ever-expanding diversity of ritual implements, such as, here we see the hitogata, but now we see that people have added spells on them. And we see new types of clay figurines, etc., which have faces, etc., painted on them. And this is all across the Japanese islands. It suggests that this has penetrated all levels of society. I think I have one more I can show you. Let me go back. Not coincidentally, we also see at this time the appearance of multiple court edicts bemoaning and prohibiting the worship of quote-unquote Chinese gods, karakami, and epidemic deities by the populace. I'm going to conclude by giving you just one example of what some of these spells look like. Here's a spell that was on a mokkan that was found from the epidemic of 737. It reads, "Beneath the southern mountain there is a still pool of water in which dwells a large 9-headed snake with one tail. It does not eat many things, but it eats 3,000 Chinese demons at sunrise and 800 at sunset, quickly, in accordance with the statutes." So, what do we do when we see hundreds, thousands of these? We can conclude this mokkan illustrates how roadways and epidemics both of which were intimately linked with the processes of urbanization and material transformation, could stimulate a wide range of ritual innovation and improvisation, and that such improvisation did occur outside the parameters of the court or the practices of the Ministry of Rites. We see several of these mokan having a rather high level of sophistication, not only because the ritualist is engaging spirits through the use of writing, but also because the text's content shows a great deal of continuity with material practices from the Chinese mainland. And when viewed together with thousands of scapegoat dolls, spell-bearing amulets, etc., that we find from the period, we can say that the residents of the capitals, at the very least, made very liberal use of ritual freelancers to interact with the spirit world. So here, as elsewhere, disease-bearing deities appear to have been appear to have been explicitly identified as demons or deities from the mainland, karakami. And this mokan was discovered within the Heijo capital. In other words, whereas the kami of Japan had been put in their place outside of the confines of the city, the karakami and disease gods, so feared by the populace, were able to make use of the roadways and streets leading up to the capital, where they could easily penetrate and where they had to be ritually propitiated. This is a map of the Heijo capital, and we see all across different ritual figurines. Umagata, the horse figures, they're being offered so that the deities will ride away on the roadways. We see hitogata, we see pottery, we see everything here. So I'd like to conclude by arguing that the key to understanding both the absence of deities from the imperial pantheon in Kuchizusami on the one hand, and the proliferation of demons, dragons, ekijin, and various other Chinese deities on the other can be traced, at least in part, to the fact that the court had forbidden the construction of shrines for kami worship within the capital. As the court recognized kami of the land came to be put in fixed locations outside the capital, residents of the capitals, ancient capitals, perforce found themselves living in a land without shrines. And whether commoners or nobles, these same residents were however, they were far from deprived of sites for engaging spirits, for the capital itself was filled with avenues and roads. And crucially, in contrast to the kami that had been given fixed residences within confines of built shrine structures, the spirits on the roadways of Japan remained in motion, with many of them penetrating the borders of the city. Once inside, their activities were thought to be frequently dangerous, always unpredictable, and worthy of regular ritual attention. This was true not only of the malevolent disease deities and demons that were believed to prey on passers-by, but also the stowaway gods associated with essential technologies and household functions that were propitiated in the courtyards, stoves, wells, gates, and even lavatories of urban residents across the city. Ironically then, among the many disruptions and discontinuities brought about by 8th century urbanization, one of the most startling, though least discussed, could be found in the ways that the ancient Japanese ritually engaged their physical environment in the superhuman world. As the kami of the imperial pantheon were put in fixed structures beyond the geographic and cultic borders of the capital, urban residents found themselves in a metropolis teeming with volatile spirits that at one and the same time were dangerous, mobile, and easy to approach. Thank you.